Hello and welcome. This week on the podcast, an extensive review of Iconoclasts, plus a special mini review of a secret special game that will be revealed later on. Plus, we've got your weekly stream recap of all the games I'm playing here on Twitch, as well as the mailbag. This is the Jasu review. Okay, hello and welcome to the Jasu review. This is the podcast where I do a weekly roundup of all the games I've been playing on stream here, what I think of them, how the playthroughs have been going, as well as some extended segments where I give you my detailed thoughts of some of the games we have played in the past, and that this week is going to be a detailed review of Iconoclasts, which is a game that we just played a few weeks ago. So those of you who listened to the previous podcast will know that Battle for West Noth is missing from this one. And I thought I'd go into that a little bit. There was a bit of a change of plans. I decided I want to keep things a lot more concise and focused on the podcast from here on out. And so with that said, I'd like to do just a little brief post-mortem wrap-up of the first episode last week where I covered the Shining Force series. I would say that episode was very non-representative of the type of podcast I'd like to be doing here. I'd like to restrict the scope a lot more. No more 2-hour podcasts. It's just that massive hassle to edit and not terribly listenable either. I don't think that 2-hour podcasts about detailed thoughts on video games is a fun thing to listen to. The whole idea of the podcast was to have a nice, relatively brief, listenable chunk of audio for you guys to listen to keep caught up with the streams and not have to, watch 20 hours of streams every week to stay caught up. So with all that said, we did a 2.5-hour podcast on Shining Force, and I still managed to miss something kind of important that I wanted to rectify. I passed over the portion in my notes where I told myself to talk about the translation of the Shining Force 3 games, because we did play a fan translation patch there, and I wanted to talk about the quality of the translation and give credit to the translators, but I didn't. I just glossed over that portion of my notes, so we missed it, and so I'll rectify this week. The translation of fan translation of Shining Force 3 is really, really good. Definitely professional quality, easily on par with the English scripts of other RPGs released at around that time, and even modern RPGs. It's very high quality stuff, well written, flows nicely, easy to read, pretty much grammatically correct and typo free. I might have noticed a couple errors here and there, but that's typical when dealing with a massive script spanning 3 games. So yeah, overall, very solid job done by the translation team and that's of course the Shining Force 3 fan translation project. If you want to check that out, Google that or whatever, and play and get into some Shining Force yourselves. That's kind of the point of the podcast, is to share these games with you. If you didn't get a chance to have them shared with you on stream, here's the podcast for me to tell you about them as well. So that's, Shining Force 3 fans translation, worth checking out. And thanks and props to all of the crew who worked on that. We would not be able to play that game in English without you guys. With that said, I'm going to try to keep things brief here. And to that end, we're going to modify the format of the podcast slightly, or rather actually put a format on it, because last week was kind of loose. We're going to experiment with a standardized format here where I do one long review each week, one featured game, something a bit meaty with a bit of complexity to it that we can really dig into and have a long discussion about. Then we'll follow it up with one mini review or short discussion topic that'll be related to either it's related to gaming culture or news, something going on, or maybe just general game design talk, something related to either the main featured game or just something of interest in general, or do a mini review of another sort of shorter, less substantive game that I've played on stream, or not played on stream, or just played on my own time, as we'll see this week. And of course, we've got the standard segments, stream news, where I keep you up to date on what I'm playing now on stream and how the playthroughs are going and what we'll be playing in the coming weeks. And then we close it all out with the mailbag. So, apart from that, there's also some miscellaneous improvements to the podcast that you might notice this week. First and foremost, you might see me shifting around in my chair a little bit, but noise-free. This time, I have rectified the squeaky chair problem, which just literally gave me nightmares when I was trying to edit the audio of last week's podcast. So we fixed that. The other problems, I guess we'll see if they get ironed out or not. It comes with practice. And, oh yeah, one last thing. New podcast time. I've decided to move the podcast time from Wednesday to Thursday at noon. That just aligns with my work schedule a little bit more nicely. I do a lot of the prep work for this when I'm at work, and after rushing to get things done for this week, it seems to me like I need that extra Wednesday evening shift to get everything prepared in time. So the podcast is going to be Thursdays at noon Central Standard Time from now on, following that standard format that I just outlined for you guys. And like I said, next up we got the main feature of the week, which is a review of Iconoclasts. Okay, so we'll begin things here with just an overview of the game itself, just the details as far as what it is, what it's about, and dig a little bit into the history of it. And then once we've done all that, we'll go into my detailed review and impressions, opinions of the game itself as I played it. So, Iconoclasts was developed by developer Joachim Sandberg, also known as Konjac, who is actually a true one-man development studio, or one-man developer. Everything that you see in this game was done by him. Graphics, music, sound effects, programming, writing, just the whole concept in general. As far as I know, he went completely unassisted in all of these aspects. That's quite a feat for a game of this scale, I would say. And apart from this, he's mostly known for a lot of small-scale kind of freeware games, sort of prototypes and browser games, that kind of thing. His last big project before this was a game called Noitu Love 2 Devolution, which is a game that I actually played on stream a long time ago, back when I was first starting out on Twitch. I had a series called the Bakuhatsu, where I went through and played a bunch of games on my Steam backlog. I think that might still be out there on the internet if you wanted to check that out. But summary of how that went. Recommended. I really liked Noitu Love 2 Devolution. It's just a quick, action-packed little romp, very treasure-esque, with a lot of just very wildly creative bosses and action set pieces. It had a unique control scheme where it was kind of a 2D platformer brawler hybrid with actual keyboard and mouse controls. There was a targeting reticle that you would move around on the screen to activate various abilities, which I was skeptical of that concept when I first heard about it, but it actually works out really well in practice. So yeah, Know What You Love team, really good game. It was released back in, I want to say, like 2010-ish, so it's kind of old at this point. And as far as I know, Sandberg hasn't put out any other major releases since then. This is his second big release, or at least the only other game that he has on the Steam store. And as far as I understand it, he has been working on Iconoclasts ever since then. So this game had like something like an 8 to 10 year development time. So yeah, it's a lot of work went into this. This game was eventually released on January 2018, just last year, and I can see why it would take so much time for one guy to make all of this. This is a much larger game than Know What You Love Devolution was. Know What You Love, great game, wildly creative, fun, action-packed, but also very limited scope. I finished it in about 40 minutes. It had a bunch of extra features for added replayability and such, but it was a pretty relatively small game. This one, much bigger, more complex, also a bit more conventional. And with that said, we'll go a bit into what this game is. So it's a 2D Metroidvania, like I said, very solidly in the 2D Metroidvania genre. Much more conventional than Know What You Love 2 was. Its probably most obvious feature is just these great, colorful, and detailed pixel graphics here. Very gorgeous sprite animation as well. You can see that in the little gameplay video I've got running here on stream if you're watching the live podcast or watching on YouTube. And you see a lot of these types of retro-inspired pixel art games on Steam. There's a lot of really great stuff out there these days in this style, and it's just games like Time Spinner, Owlboy, Mercenary Kings. They just keep upping the bar on these just fantastic retro-styled pixel art video games, and this is another one. So the bar has been raised. How does it stack up? Well, I think you can see just based on the trailers of the game how it compares to other games of this nature. As far as the stuff that you can't see, it turns out that this game ends up being very story driven in the end, which is slightly unique among Metroidvanias. The whole premise of the game is that it's set in this society that is controlled by a totalitarian theocracy called the One Concern, and you play as this character Robin, who is a renegade mechanic. So machinery, there's all sorts of ancient machinery littered throughout the and technology and whatnot littered throughout this world, and you are a unlicensed mechanic. All this technology is very strictly regulated by One Concern, and you are renegade unlicensed mechanic who goes around tinkering with stuff with your big ass wrench, which is basically what the game is about. It's also a very strongly character driven story. There is a supporting cast that factors into not just the story but the gameplay as well quite strongly. You'll team up with different characters during boss battles, have them sort of follow you around for different gameplay set pieces. It ends up being a pretty serious story as well. I guess there's like some whimsy and comedy to it, but also some harrowing stuff that goes down. It's tough to describe the story of this one. We'll go into that in a bit more detail later. Apart from that, as to the actual gameplay, it's very puzzly for a Metroidvania, which is a bit surprising. Most Metroidvanias tend to be more exploration-based, whereas this one is largely centered around puzzle solving. A lot of the rooms you'll encounter are just big puzzle rooms that you'll use your expansive tool set to work your way through. There's not a lot of major upgrades like in a lot of other Metroidvanias. Most of the game is quite linear. It's a gated by plot circumstances rather than by new upgrades that you find to unlock new areas. A bit like something like Metroid Fusion or Shantae in that regard. So you've got a pretty interesting move set in this game. You've got 3 different guns that doesn't sound like a lot, but they got a lot of different secondary features which factor into the puzzle solving. You've got a short range stun gun, a grenade launcher with a bit of a delayed fuse, and then a laser gun, and all of those have secondary features that are quite different from the main firing options if you charge them up. So yeah, every gun is chargeable and does at least 2 distinct things, and you'll be using these different features of your weapons to solve puzzles. And of course, there's also your mechanics wrench, which is kind of the centerpiece of the whole player control setup. The wrench is an extremely versatile tool. There's a lot of stuff you can do with it. There's your standard club enemies on the head with it. You can turn nuts that you find throughout the game world to operate machinery. You can swing off of nuts. You got some kind of swinging puzzles and set pieces. You can twirl your wrench to reflect enemy projectiles. You can electrify it to charge up different bits of machinery. You can go along zip lines with your wrench. It's all sorts of different stuff you can do with it. It's a really interesting and extremely dynamic and versatile tool. And you're just moving throughout the game world, solving puzzles with all of these different moves. On top of all that, you've got the tweak system, which works a bit like the pin system in Hollow Knight or badges in Paper Mario, if you know that game. The way it works is you have 3 slots on your character for what are called tweaks, which are little, just tiny little upgrades to your character. Little things like extra movement speed, or let you block a hit, breathe longer underwater, that kind of thing. And it lets you kind of customize and tweak out your character a little bit, but there's also a unique system going on here that's different from Hollow Knight or Paper Mario, which is where if you take a hit, it disables one of your tweaks and you go right to left. So if you take 1 hit, that disables your first tweak slot. Get hit again, that disables your second one. But you can repair your tweaks and earn them back by destroying enemies, breaking objects in the environment. So it's like you lose them for getting hit, but you can charge them back up by breaking stuff and killing enemies, which is a cool little system. It's a bit reminiscent of the weapon upgrade system in Cave Story. And also the tweak system drives a lot of the exploration in this game. A lot of the things hidden in the game world that you'll find are related to tweaks. You'll either get schematics that'll unlock new tweaks for you to purchase, and you'll get upgrade materials that you use to purchase those tweaks. So you get schematics that expands the list of tweaks to buy, and then you get the materials, I think it's Impruvium and Oilium and one other one, Metallium, that you'll spend to buy those tweaks. Apart from that, boss fights, just like in Noi 2 Love 2 Devolution, are very heavily featured in this game. They advertise in the trailer over 20 boss fights. They're all big blowout set pieces with lots of different phases and transformations that they go through. Usually a lot of unique mechanics introduced in each one as well. And as well as team-up fights with your supporting cast, like I mentioned earlier. And also some puzzle solving involved with some of the bosses as well, where you're using your moveset in different ways to try to figure out how to damage the bosses. So that's a general overview of what the game is and what you can expect going into it. And with all that said, we will go into the next segment where I give you my detailed critique and summary of what I thought of the game. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, or even more than a little bit, about what I thought about this game. So this is a late review. I mentioned in the summary that this was released in January 2018, so I'm a little over a year late on this one. I was aware of Konjac, the developer at the time. I took notice of this game. I like I said, I played Noi to Love 2 and really liked it. I saw Iconoclasts on Steam. It was immediately appealing to me. Put it on the wish list, but there was just too much other stuff to play that year, especially in the retro indie pixel art kind of category. So if you've been following the streams since last year, you'll know I opted for games like La Mulana 2, Time Spinner, Mega Man 11, which I guess is kind of way slightly adjacent to this kind of category, retro type games that I was just slightly more interested in than this one. But earlier this year, Iconoclasts, I was reminded of this game by a couple of viewers who mentioned that they would be interested to see me play this one. So yeah, I decided to, hey, people want to see me play this, I want to play it, let's play the thing and see how it is. And so I really liked it. This was a really, really fun game, even more so than I was expecting. I had moderately high expectations going into this, and I'd say they were surpassed. This is a game that really started strong and just kind of grew on me from there. You know how some games you're kind of lukewarm at first, and then it grows on you over time as you play through it. This one just like started out instantly. I liked it, and then it grew on me over time from there even. So yeah, this is a really, like I said, a really ambitious game, especially for a one-man development studio. Also very diverse. There's a lot of stuff going on here, just in terms of you've got your action set pieces and enemy battles and the giant boss battles and stuff. You've got the exploration aspect of moving around in the environments and discovering different hidden things. You've got puzzle rooms that incorporate all your diverse moveset that I went over in the summary. And on top of all that, it's a strongly story-based game as well. So there's a lot of things going on here, and I'd say the game doesn't quite nail every aspect of that, but it all balances out well in the end. It's all very well integrated, and every aspect, even if it isn't perfect, and there's some few flaws here and there, it does all of those different things well enough. So yeah, it's a very well balanced package. Although with that said, there is a bit of negatives in each aspect to balance out the good things as well. Though to start with the good things, I'd say the highlight of the game for me was the controls. I mentioned just you've got a relatively small toolbox, but your tools in this game are very diverse. You've got only 3 different guns, which doesn't sound like a lot for a Metroidvania. Like compare it to something like Axiom Verge that has like dozens of different weapons. But your guns in this game are, like I said, extremely versatile, and the puzzles do a really good job of just showing off all the different subtle secondary features of the way your weapons work. Like you use the delayed fuse on the grenade launcher to solve some different puzzles. You've got a laser with long range that you can charge up to swap places with enemies and objects. Of course, your standard short range stun gun, which is kind of your just generic fight enemies weapon, but can also be charged up to blast away rocks and barriers on enemies and that kind of stuff. Incidentally, the stun gun was probably my favorite weapon to use, just because it's the one where you can really hammer down on the shot button. The other weapons have a long cooldown after you shoot them, but the stun gun you could just mash away and rapid fire, which is something I just like doing in video games in general. Any game that gives you an excuse to mash the square button as fast as you can is always just a positive in my book. And then on top of all that you got the wrench as well, which is kind of the star of the whole show in terms of player control and everything. You've got all these different moves, all fun and useful. Again, very Treasure-esque in just the vast array of different interesting moves you have at your disposal. But it's almost a little bit better than a lot of Treasure games. A lot of Treasure games sort of fail to incorporate some of your more interesting moves in the gameplay. Like you'll have moves in Gunstar Heroes like the backslide and the blocking and whatnot that are just kind of there, and the game doesn't really demand that you use them. This Iconoclasts actually does a really good job of requiring you to use all the different moves that you have at your disposal, and they're all just really generally useful as well. I found myself making heavy use of wrench twirling and ziplining and the down stomp and all these different moves. They're all fun, all very. The game, makes clever use of them in its puzzles and boss fights. Play control, extremely solid. I actually don't think I have anything negative to say as far as the controls and the basic move set. Although, in terms of other gameplay stuff, the tweaks, I had some issues with the whole tweak system that I went into in the summary. I really love the concept. I've always liked the badge system in the Paper Mario games, and then Hollow Knight, which basically incorporated the same system. It gives you a lot of options for character customization, and you got this like big menu of interesting little power-ups, and you kind of just pick and choose which ones you want to add to your character. It's almost like you've got your own unique little kitted out character that'll be suited to your play style. So I've always loved that concept, and it's sort of an innovation here. They took two good things and mashed them together here. You got that the way that the tweaks break, and it's a bit like the weapon upgrade system in Cave Story, where it's I like it a lot because it incentivizes skillful play. We talked about this a bit last week with the friendship system in Shining Force 3. It's a rare thing to find a game that really incentivizes skillful play without brutally punishing you for failure. The tweaks in this game are just kind of minor things, so it mostly doesn't feel crippling when you lose them. And if you just, pick yourself up, start playing smart, you can get them back by just playing well and destroying enemies and not taking any more hits. So it's a great system in theory, and it actually goes well with the Metroidvania format here too, where you've got something interesting to go exploring for. Oh, you're picking up all these new unique tweaks. How fun. I've got something to look for. Where the tweak system falls down is that the tweaks themselves are mostly super lame, I found, in this game. You got stuff like, they're just, for the most part, extremely situational, bordering on useless. You got stuff like, you can wrench twirl for a little bit longer, which is barely noticeable, and I don't think ever useful in the game. You can hold your breath underwater a little bit longer, which is, again, not necessary or useful, except in this one little side boss where you need it to get to. You've got little micro upgrades to your weapons, like a small increased blast radius for your grenade. You can shoot through walls with your laser beam. But again, because the game is set up based around your core moveset and not these tweaks, it doesn't feel like you're gaining much. Like the tweaks I used throughout the game, the ones that were just generically useful, like take an extra hit, where when the tweak breaks, it just blocks all the damage from that hit that you took. That one's really useful. Just extra movement speed. Kind of boring, but it's better than all the other stuff in the game. And then apart from that, you've got the one really useful tweak in the game, which is the one that I had throughout the entire thing, which is the dodge roll, which is borderline game breaking, where it gives you a dodge roll. You can just suddenly roll to the side, and it makes you invincible for a little while. You can kind of cheat your way through a lot of enemy attacks, and it almost starts to feel like a core part of your moveset with just how useful it is. But sometimes it wouldn't work because of the breaking system, where if you take too many hits, that tweak is going to break and you lose it. So it was a bit frustrating at times, where it's almost too impactful. It actually did feel really punishing when I started doing badly, and I would start to forget that I didn't have my dodge roll because of the tweaks breaking. And you can see it. You can see when you look at it that way, it sort of begins to justify why the other tweaks aren't nearly so impactful. You don't want anything that's going to completely change the way your character controls to be sort of an on-off toggle based on whether you get hit. You don't want your core strategy of your character to be disabled because you took a couple hits. So that it makes sense why they don't have super impactful tweaks. But as I don't know. I don't have any ideas myself, but the whole tweak system felt a bit half-baked. Or the system was solid, but it felt like they didn't have any really solid ideas for what to do with it or what additions to put on your character. Because the whole core moveset is so well fleshed out. It's like, what else do you need? What else is going to be useful when you've got all these great tools at your disposal? So yeah, I didn't like the tweak system in the end. But with that said, again, going back to the core moveset, the puzzles in this game are quite good. They flow surprisingly nicely with all the other stuff going on in this game. They're not overly complex, and I didn't really get stuck on them too often, but for the most part, they took at least a bit of thought. Some of them were actually really clever, and you don't want puzzles to be too complicated in this type of format where you've got a game that's heavily story driven and also driven by action set pieces. It would just break the flow to have puzzles that are too difficult and too complex. So I think they just nailed just the right balance of puzzles that are somewhat complex but not sticking points and also still interesting. Again, very well balanced overall. The types of puzzles you see, it's a lot of disentanglement type stuff. Also a few where you've got to think of clever uses for your different tools that you might not have considered before. Some observational puzzles where you've got to notice and exploit certain terrain features in conjunction with your moveset. Yeah, I really liked the puzzles. The one downside of this is that of the whole notion of a puzzly Metroidvania, and you'll see a lot of other games have this problem too, where when you combine a puzzle game with a Metroidvania game, you've always got the classic problem of when you get stuck on a puzzle, it's, am I missing something here? Am I just stupid and I need to figure something out in this room? Or am I missing a tool a Metroidvania tool that I'm gonna get later in the game and come back to this? And that ended up happening to me several times in this game. Pretty much every time I got stuck on a puzzle, and I would just agonize over, is there something else going on here? Am I missing a tool? And I would get stuck on these puzzles and I would just skip them, and it would turn out that, oh yeah, I just didn't have the laser swap gun and I needed to come back with that later on. I wish that those types of puzzles were a little bit more well indicated in general as to, or I don't know, maybe there were clever solutions to solve those puzzles early, but it really didn't look like it to me. And actually, in general, I would prefer it overall if these types of games would generally have all of the puzzles be solvable the first time you see them. That was the approach that Braid took, with one notable terrible exception. And I think that's the proper way to do these types of games. So there were some puzzles in La Mulana that were that way as well, where it would be like a difficult puzzle. You could solve a lot of the puzzles in La Mulana the first time you see them, and then there were some that were really tricky to solve when you first encounter them, but they could be made easier if you come back with your different tools that you get later in the game. And to be clear, La Mulana is also a game where that actually has this problem, even more so, where there's a lot of puzzles in that game where it's you just need tools that you'll get later on, and it's not obvious. But yeah, this game has that same problem. Almost every Metroidvania puzzle-based game has that problem. With that said, the other sort of Metroidvania-ing aspect of this game is the exploration. And so that's driven in a couple different ways. On the one hand, you've got your side rooms that are sort of off the beaten path. Like I said, there's not a ton of exploration or even any non-linearity to this game. You basically just follow the set path through the game that they just give to you straight up. And it's a lot of the content is gated behind plot beats and different things happening in the story, as opposed to expanding your move set and reaching new places. But the bit of non-linearity that you do have, you got a lot of side puzzle rooms, which are great, where you just go into a little side room. There's a neat little puzzle that'll be a little bit trickier than the stuff on the main path, and then you solve that, and you get some improvium or oilium or a tweak schematic or something like that. And that's kind of the weak point of the exploration in this game. Is it is all driven by the tweak system, which, as we established, is mostly stuff that isn't very fun or interesting. And tweaks is basically the only thing you get from exploring in this game. There are no weapon or health upgrades. It's all tweaks and materials to help you, or tweak schematics and materials to build those tweaks. So as a result, a lot of the exploration felt very unrewarding to me. And apart from that, the path of the exploration that wasn't puzzly side rooms was all a lot of hidden walls, which is kind of my least favorite Metroidvania trope. And also, there's not a lot of navigation aids that the game gives you. Basically, you go to a previous area and it says, oh, I've got 95% of the items here. Where is that one other thing? And it shows you where the chests are on the map, but it doesn't show you the secret side rooms. So you need to find those bombable walls hidden behind a bit of foreground scenery, or the fake walls and stuff like that. Now, you do get a tweak in the game that pops up a little alert when you're in a room with a false wall, with a fake wall. But that tweak itself is actually kind of well hidden, and it actually ended up being one of the last tweaks that I found in the whole game. I had found almost everything by the time I found that one tweak that lights up when you're in a room with a fake wall. So it ended up being not that useful, and I found just sweeping the map for 100% to be not especially fun, and I kind of regret doing it in the end. Again, it felt kind of unrewarding, just kind of tediously backtracking through every room in the game, looking for the hidden side paths, and then when you do find them, it's just some more improvium for a tweak that lets you hold your breath slightly longer. It's like, it felt unrewarding. I regret going back for the 100% in this game. I wish I had just called my playthrough once I had cleared the final boss. So yeah, bosses, another high point. After, dwelling on the negative here, I don't actually have a lot to say about the bosses, just because they're really great. Just wildly creative. They're diverse. A lot of them add new and interesting game mechanisms. They exploit your core moveset really well. They're just really cool looking as well. You got some great boss music as well. Oh yeah, I don't even have in my notes to talk about the music. The music's good. You'll hear the music over the course of the podcast. It's also, the bosses are really challenging as well. Probably the single biggest challenge in the game is the bosses, more so than the puzzles and the regular enemies and stuff. And I don't want to gloss over this too quickly, because it felt like we dwelt on a lot of the negative stuff here, so I'd like to kind of dwell on the positive. The highlights were definitely the team up fights. It kind of helped flesh out the side characters as well, get you a little bit more attached to them, where you do fights with your supporting cast, and they'll do things like use their weapons to blow open weak points for the bosses, or even tag team fights where you play as your supporting cast and they have their own unique move set. Actually, the one tag team fight with the character Mina, the green-clad pirate there, was one of my favorite fights in the game. It's just solid all around. Again, another thing where I have nothing negative to say here. I think as far as bosses I think they were all good. Were there any bad boss fights in this game? I'm like racking. You know what? There was one. There was precisely one bad boss fight in this game, but there was a story excuse for it. There was a story reason for that boss fight to be set up the way it was. So maybe I'll give him a pass for that one, I guess. And with that said, we're going to get into a little bit of story talk here. I had mixed opinions of the story in the end. This was the one thing that really grew on me the most over the course of the game. All the gameplay stuff, I again came to appreciate a bit more as I played through the game. The story I started out lukewarm on. I ended up liking it in the end. It really grew on me over the course of the game. And I've seen interviews with the developer Joachim Sandberg, where he mentions that story is kind of an important part of the game for him. He considers it a major selling point of Iconoclasts. So for that reason, I'm not going to go into too many plot details here. We're not going to give any spoilers. So I'll try to just give my overall non-spoilery summary of what I thought of the story here. Like I said, it took time to grow on me. They give you the basics of the setting here, where it's like, the totalitarian, theocratic, one concern, you're a renegade mechanic, and then they kind of very slowly stagger out the rest of the exposition about the setting over the course of the game. It's a bit of a slow build in terms of world building, which is fair enough, because it turns out this ends up being a fairly detailed setting in terms of just the society that the different societies in the game world, and the different factions and their interrelations with each other, the character histories as well. A lot of the characters have detailed backstories that underpin all their motivations, and it takes a long time to set all of that up. And a lot of the way that the game likes to set that up and kind of tantalize you with things is in the early to mid game. There's a lot of cryptic references to just things, people, events that you just don't know anything about yet, which I find kind of an annoying storytelling device. It just makes it so you have no idea what people are talking about half the times, and it just feels a bit overwhelming and difficult to follow, at least for me. In addition to that, the script is a bit verbose for my tastes. And we'll get into that in a second, but as far as the actual progression of like what you do in the game is simple enough. It's linear, place to place to place. Everything's very clearly motivated. You have a reason to be at any given place at a given time, but there's not a lot of broader context, I felt, for what type of world you're in and why characters are doing the things they're doing and behaving the way they are. It's very mysterious, but it's the pacing and organization of the different revelations of all these underlying factors felt a bit jumbled to me. It just didn't flow overall until the very end, at which point I had all the information I needed to understand what was going on. I also had issues with the writing. For starters, it was just overly verbose for my tastes. I know, an ironic thing to say, given that we're how long we are into this podcast already when I said it would be under an hour. Apart from that, it doesn't read very well. It's full of a lot of just awkward, clunky phrasings. Just weirdly complex and non-conversational sentence structures. I don't want to criticize it too much. Like it's not horrible. It's grammatically, it's all grammatical at the very least, but it's not conversationally written. The character dialogue doesn't flow very nicely, I didn't think. It was clunky and tough to follow at times. I had to reread sentences sometimes to try to figure out what characters were saying. With that said, it's not bad. It's grammatical, and there were the occasional bits of cleverness. Some of the comedy in this game works decently too, to sort of highlight that cleverness. Actually, I remember one thing that stuck out to me. That's a good. Well representative of the script overall is there was at one point in the game a character says to someone else, he's like this sort of preacher type guy who's constantly reading lines from this holy text, and another character says to him something like, "I'll shove that book up your ass and then that'll give you enough spine to stop slouching for a minute," something like that. It was a clever little pun that's kind of a dig at his character too. But it was also kind of awkwardly phrased and didn't quite flow. And I feel like that's a good metaphor for not just the script, but the game's plot as a whole. There's some really interesting and clever underlying material here, a lot of interesting ideas at the bottom of all of this. But the presentation is a bit clunky and doesn't flow well. I thought the script needed heavy editing. With that said, it is and it kind of made it tougher to connect with the characters as well, although I had other issues with the characters. This isn't really a downside to the game as a whole. I found the characters tough to connect with even apart from the writing. They're the style of this game, it's kind of melodramatic. There's like a lot of everyone's shit is all emotional a lot of the time, and the characters are all just very broadly drawn, strong personalities, which makes them entertaining to observe. And I was always interested in what was going on in the plot with these characters, but I didn't identify with everyone or with anyone or find them particularly likable. There's a lot of melodrama in the story. Everyone's all emotional, and they're either just constantly screaming or brooding, or there are some kind of some variety of preening narcissist. It's that kind of covers, you've pretty much got your supporting cast covered right there. You've got the screaming, emotional one, Mina. You got the dark, brooding Elro, and then you've got the preening narcissist, what's his name, Royal. And that's your core. And then, of course, you've got the stoic, silent Robin, who is a silent protagonist, kind of rounding them all out. And she serves as a good center to all of this. The character drama was interesting, entertaining, but I wasn't especially invested in the character's outcomes. And there's one particular character's outcome at the end of the game, which could make for a good stream highlight if I could fish it out. There's a dramatic moment near the end of the game that I perhaps didn't react to in the way that a lot of other players did. There was one exception to all of this. There was one character, one of the main villains, Agent Black, who I actually liked quite a bit. She's kind of the same style of character as the other core cast members, very broadly drawn, overly emotional. She's extremely irritable, annoyed by everyone, and a very angry person. But I should say this. The characters don't feel irrational. They all have very well developed backstories and logical reasons for acting and acting the way they do and behaving and doing the things that they do throughout the story. Again, the underlying material is solid. Everything is logical. There's a reason for everyone to be the way they are. It's just, again, kind of in the presentation. And that's true of Agent Black especially. You find out sort of what's going on with her. And she has a very good reason to be constantly just annoyed with everyone and prone to outbursts of rage. And her irritation with the other characters in the game leads her to acts of great and terrible violence, which was kind of a highlight of the story for me. Because again, these characters kind of annoyed me too. So Black and I were on the same page like that. And it was really fun to see her I'm not going to spoil it. She does things to some of the characters, and I really enjoyed it. Maybe that says something more about me than about the quality of the writing and the story in this game. I don't know. It's a very interesting story. A lot of depth here. I don't want more than anything else in the review. This is the story is the one thing I'm the most unsure of. I really think you need to dig a bit to get at the really interesting bits, and it probably needs at least a second playthrough to fully understand everything. I think I would have more of substance to say about the story if I played it a second time, but I didn't do that. I only played this game once before doing this review. I did the full 100% run, did some boss rush stuff. As far as the one thing useful bit of feedback I think I can give about the story is there's always the big question in games of this type that are heavily story driven is the story worth it? It's like, should I bother reading the text? Is it going to be a waste of my time in the end if I sit through and read all of this stuff? Or conversely, am I going to be missing out on something special or worthwhile if I skip out on everything? And overall, I would say I recommend reading the dialogue in this game and following the story. It's a bit of a tough sit in the early bits, but I think it's worth it in the end. So I would, in terms of like the don't skip, that's sort of the thumbs up, thumbs down review of the story in this game, I give it a thumbs up. I would say stick with it, and there's some interesting stuff here. Everything will be revealed in the end, and it'll all be worthwhile. So that's my summary of the story. Overall, excellent game. Very strongly recommended. A solid all-around package. It's phenomenal that there's all these different factors in play in this game, and yet it all flows and integrates well, nicely together. Extremely solid. A few hiccups, but all the good stuff outweighs almost all of the bad stuff. Story, action, puzzles, exploration is probably the weak point. But that's my take on Iconoclasts. Final score, 4 out of 5. You can, if you're interested in this game, you can find it on PC, which is where I played it, the PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita, and Switch. Okay, this is kind of an experimental little segment at the end of our Iconoclasts talk here. So be interested to hear what you guys think of this one when we get to the end of this. So a lot of the time when I'm just thinking a lot about these games, a lot of little side topics come up that are really interesting to me, just from a general game design and gaming culture type of perspective, but they don't really fit neatly into the main review. I like to keep the discussion of the game focused on the game itself, but I'd also like to talk a little bit about these side topics that are kind of orthogonal to or closely related to the game. So I think I'm going to stick all those in this odds and ends segment at the end of the review. There's a couple interesting topics that I kept on thinking about when I was reflecting on my experience with Iconoclasts. The biggest one was just the notion of Metroidvanias in general. What is the point of them? What is the benefit of the format? I've seen a lot of hot takes on just Twitter, Reddit, just video game discussion forums in general, where there's kind of a backlash against the Metroidvania format these days, whereas people say that they're kind of inferior to your good old classic stage-based linear progression kind of arcade-style platformers, where just the Metroidvanias, there's a lot of backtracking that ruins the flow of things. The levels are a lot more loosely designed as opposed to the very tight, economical, thoughtful enemy placement and design of traditional platformer levels. Metroidvanias, just much more scattered, loose, less focused. Bad pacing where you get lost all the time, whereas your traditional platformer, it's almost like a piece of music. It's like it ebbs and flows in a kind of a precisely constructed linear fashion, and you lose out on all of that to a large extent with the Metroidvania focus. Lazy is the word that keeps on popping up among these critics. Now, to counterbalance that, this is not really a mainstream opinion, just kind of hot takes from random, gaming opinionators on the internet. There is a basic appeal of Metroidvanias that I think resonates strongly with people. It's a popular format. There's a lot of these types of games out there these days. They're selling well. So there is something going on with Metroidvanias that makes them appealing to gamers in general. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the notion of progression, the increase in power of your character over time, which is a thing that you don't get in a lot of platformers. Most traditional stage-based linear platformers do not have characters that increase in power over the course of the game. And also, there's the fun aspect, the notion of retreading old territory with new abilities and powers. It's like you're backtracking through old stuff, but it's a bit different this time because you've got all of these new abilities to play around with. You get to see new sights the second time you go through an area, which again is a thing that doesn't really exist in traditional platformers. And lastly, you've got kind of just the basic satisfaction of sweeping the map and, again, seeing those numbers go up, like the progression-based stuff where it's map squares, percentage points, digging into every nook and cranny to find all the secret stuff. There's a basic appeal here. But with that said, I feel like a lot of that is kind of a shallow appeal. Like the whole notion of progression and the increase in power is a basic sort of primal, like it's like a Skinner box mechanism type thing. You get that type of satisfaction from clickers that you play on your mobile phone or whatever, or in your browser or whatever. So that a lot of the appeal of Metroidvanias for some people, I think, is just kind of packing that type of thing in a 2D platformer. And with that said, I do broadly have a lot of sympathy and even agree largely with the critics of the genre. I think that all the things they say that are bad about Metroidvanias are true of most Metroidvanias. But nevertheless, I still like the Metroidvania format. A lot of my favorite games are Metroidvanias. We're talking about La Mulana, classics like Symphony of the Night, Metroidvania, Super Metroid, which are, of course, the two namesakes of the genre. So why is that? I feel like there's a bit more to a good Metroidvania than just those basic appeal points that I mentioned, where you've just got progression, increase in power, digging into every corner of the map, all that type of stuff. And that is, the Metroidvania format offers kind of a very different feel from your traditional 2D linear platformer, which is where the linear platformers stage based are generally quite forward driven. You're constantly moving forward through one action set piece after another, whereas the Metroidvania is a lot more of a relaxed pace, which certainly appeals to a lot of people, but also that type of varied pacing lends itself well to just different types of games that are a lot more atmospheric. A lot of the best Metroidvanias are very kind of lonely, thoughtful experiences. They're not heavily plot driven either. The plot tends to be kind of a background thing going on behind the scenes related to the environment more so. Here we're talking about games like Hollow Knight, Metroid, Symphony of the Night, all the greats. And it's also, Metroidvanias are great for establishing a cohesive world, like a setting that you can really explore and dig around in. And it's like, I think almost all of the most memorable game worlds are in Metroidvanias, at least as far as 2D platformers. Like places like Hallow Nest, Zebes in Super Metroid, Dracula's Castle, Lordran in Dark Souls, just to get that in there. Are some of the most memorable just places in video games, I think, and it's because they're very cohesive, well-established worlds in the end. Like Zebes, like in Metroid, feel like you're exploring a planet. There's the upper layer, you dig deep into the core, into Norfair, you've got kind of the greenery. It all fits together very nicely, and there's a reason for it to fit together, and the way it fits together helps to establish you give a real sense of place about the experience. So I think that's what Metroidvanias do well. And so with all that said, does Iconoclasts really benefit from being a Metroidvania? And I actually am not sure that it does in the end. Like I said, a lot of the Metroidvania aspects, the exploration and digging into the side areas to find all the secret stuff, was not especially compelling. And apart from that, it's very plot driven, so you can end up ruining the pacing a little bit if you get lost too much. I think that heavily plot driven games kind of need a bit of a forward drive to them, and the Metroidvania format detracts from that a little bit. It's also the game world doesn't seem to benefit from it much as well. I talked about setting earlier. I was talking mostly about setting in terms of the environment when I was talking about Metroidvania world building and setting building and all of that. The Iconoclast has a detailed setting, but it's more about the culture of these different societies and whatnot, and not so much about the physical environment. Like you've got the underwater pirate village, which is an interesting little place. They've got their own little side culture, their own different conflicts with the world above. And so that's all interesting. And then the Metroidvania area surrounding it is just kind of generic video game water world. I don't want to talk down about it too much. The environments in this game are bright and appealing and everything, but they aren't essential to establishing the setting. So I'm not sure that the whole Metroidvania thing helps very much. I think the game might have been better as a strictly linear, stage-based 2D platformer. Although with that said, there's something to be said about you have a bit more freedom as far as the flow of the plot, whereas linear 2D platformers, stage-based ones, are very forward-driven. The Metroidvania format gives you a bit of flexibility there, where you have a bit of time to relax. Like there are times in the game where you backtrack back to Blockrock to talk to some of the people there. So it's like, you go back to your starting town, where it's tough to manage that kind of thing. Points in the story where you need to backtrack to previous locations, it's tough to fit that in. I think that Shantae actually had the right idea here, where you've got these big open levels where it's kind of non-linear, different nooks and crannies to explore, kind of Metroidvania-like, but not a massive interconnected world that's a bit tedious to backtrack through. Shantae and starting with Pirate's Curse, the Shantae games have selectable levels, which I think worked a lot better for just the style of game it was and the flow of the story and everything. So I think that might have been the ideal format for Iconoclasts is same levels, just make them selectable as opposed to all interconnected. And overall, I think Shantae is actually a very similar game to this one, or I think it's more likely that they have a common ancestry. I know Shantae is definitely heavily influenced by Monster World 4, and I've seen in interviews that Sandberg says that he was also influenced by the same games as Shantae, Monster World 4, Metroid Fusion, all that. So it kind of makes sense that they end up being very similar games in the end. And to be clear, I think Iconoclasts is a much better game than Pirate's Curse. There's just this one little thing where I think they could have taken cues from, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse. With that said, I feel really shitty playing armchair developer just armchair game dev here to someone just as amazingly multi-talented as Joachim Sandberg. And that's the other topic that I want to get into here, which is the notion of a one-man development team. You see this come up all the time in just discussion and reviews of not just Iconoclast, but other games made by one-man dev teams, stuff like blanking on other examples here. There's obviously the first one by Pixel, the title of which I'm forgetting. Cave Story is the one I'm thinking of. There's the other one. It's like kind of it's got a teal furry as the protagonist. I haven't played that one, but that's another one people talk about. It comes up all the time. It's something that really seems to capture the public imagination, is just the notion of these massive, sweeping, ambitious games that stand up well to the best of the industry being developed by these little one-man projects, essentially. And I agree, it's really cool that people are mad that one person can do all of this, but I don't know, does it really affect our overall evaluation of the game? Like, it's really impressive to think about just in the abstract, sitting back, it's like, whoa, one guy did all of this, but it's not something that comes up in the course of gameplay. Like, it seems obvious to me. Like, are you really constantly thinking to yourself as you play Iconoclast, like, whoa, this is a great control scheme, and one guy did all this. Oh, great bosses, one guy. It's something that's like, is an interesting bit of trivia, but it doesn't make the game itself any better. Which kind of raises the question, similar to the question of what is the point of Metroidvanias, what is the point of the one-man studio? Because it's like, it doesn't affect our evaluation of the game itself. Like, the game is the game, regardless of how many people made it or who made it or whatever. I feel like I just made a controversial political statement there somehow. The game is the game, regardless of who made it. We'll leave that to the side for another time, maybe. But, so yeah, it seems like it's all downsides to me as far as the one-man team. Almost any game would be made better by adding more people. First off, as a one-man group, or just any development team in general, is going to be limited by just their weakest portion. And so if you're a great artist but a so-so composer, you can elevate the quality of your music by hiring on a professional musician. It's just one person can't do everything. They can do everything well enough, maybe, but they won't be the best at everything. So even if you're good at music, you'll have better music by hiring a dedicated music composer who's a professional and has dedicated their life and career to it. Same with every aspect of games, programming, graphics, all of that stuff. You're going to be hindered by your weakest point, and you can round out those weaknesses by adding more people to the team. Your scope is going to be limited if you're a one-man crew. One person can only put out so much content. Like I said, it took Konjac like almost 10 years to make this game, whereas I think even hiring on one person would have shortened that a massive amount. And furthermore, it limits the scope. You can put in more content, more levels, more characters, animations, just like more stuff in general you can fit into the game by having more people on hand to produce it. Again, it just inherently, there's only so big that these one-man projects can get. If you want something big, epic, sprawling like Dark Souls or a Witcher 3, you need massive development studios, and I tend to prefer the big epics myself. Like, there's something to be said about, short, sweet, and elegant, but, I always say, if less is more, then just think how much more and more and more will be beyond that. It's like, I don't know, maybe it's just me. Although with that said, so then the question remains, are there any benefits to the one. It sounds. I talked about how I didn't want to shit all over this fantastically talented developer, and it sounds like I'm doing that now. But we're going to bring it around it again. I'm going to turn the ship around here, and bring it home. The question remains: what is the point of the one-man studio? Are there any benefits? And I think that there are. There is something to be said for centralized auteur control, where it's like everything is well integrated in a single mind. There's also something to be said for the development style. You're completely changing the nature of the game development as soon as you bring in a single other person. If you've got a strong central vision for what you want your game to be, you've got to be able to communicate that in great detail to another person. It's suddenly, in addition to all your artistic and musical and programming skills, the game is now also contingent on your communication and management skills, which is not. And then, so if you don't have those skills, you've got to bring in like a project manager, and you're kind of giving away that centralized artistic vision. And I think that is where the benefit of the one-man team comes in. And I think if any of this sounds familiar to you in terms of everything being very integrated and centralized towards a singular focus, if all of that sounds familiar to you from the review, yeah, I think Iconoclasts is a poster child for the benefits of a one-man studio. It's a great all-round package. It's astounding, too, that I talked about being limited in terms of your weaknesses. There are really no weak points here in terms of just technical prowess. The graphics in this game are great. The music is great. It's solidly programmed, no glitches or anything, well-designed. It's just it's an astounding feat that one person is able to be so good at all of these different things. And all of it's brought together into a great all-round, well-integrated, well-balanced package. Story, gameplay, graphics, all solid, all flow nicely and are balanced around each other. Maybe he could have used an editor, like someone to take just an extremely ruthless pass editing the script. Other than that, though, cohesive, well-integrated package, characteristic, perhaps this type of game that could only be made by a one-man team, and that's the relation of Iconoclasts to the notion of a one-man team. That's all I got for you for odds and ends. Let me know what you think about this segment. Is this interesting to you? Should I keep it in? Should I just leave this stuff on the cutting room floor from here on out? I'd be interested to hear your feedback. But at long last, that's everything I have to say about Iconoclasts, and we're going to move on to the next game here. This is going to be a lot shorter than the Iconoclasts talk. We got a special mini review of a game that I'm sure at least some of you guys will be interested in. We're going to talk about that right away. Okay, we're going to start things off here by not talking directly about the game, but rather about some of the background information, background history that preceded it and kind of set the stage for games like this to be released. So a while back, I want to say about a year ago, there was a big controversy surrounding the Steam store guidelines, what kind of games they would accept onto Steam, what the rules were in terms of what you were permitted to sell there. As I recall, it was all kicked off by, there was a game called AIDS Simulator released on Steam. A horrible little game. It ended up getting banned. I think the premise, it's a lazy asset flip first-person shooter where the premise was you are a tourist who travels to Africa, gets AIDS from a prostitute, and then just goes around on a killing spree. It's basically an excuse to shoot black people, and it's an awful, horrible game. Eventually ended up getting banned due to some, not for content, but due to some technicality surrounding the developer's behavior in the past. But it kicked off this discussion as to what is Steam tying themselves to? What are they committed? What standards are they committed to upholding? And at around that same time, a bunch of other adult, not like horrible, racist shock value non-games that are up there just for shock value, but actual games with adult-ish content in them. Games like Honey Pop. There was another one called Mutiny. All of them got notices saying, "Hey, your content, your game has content that violates Steam guidelines, and we need you to change it." With no details as to what those violations were and what the actual standards were that they had supposedly violated. So, as I understand it, Steam had kind of handled things on an individual basis. You submit your game to Steam, they look it over, and they tell you, "Oh, you need to change this," or whatever. So the developers of these games had initially gone through the whole rigmarole of what they're allowed to put in and whatnot, and they got approval to get on the Steam store. These are not newly released games. I think Honey Pop had been up there for like 2 years at this point when they had suddenly gotten that takedown notice. And it was really baffling. It was a big controversy. And it ended up with Steam reversing that decision. And they ended up clarifying their guidelines. And this was the big point that it was all coming to, where basically the new standard was essentially anything goes. "We do not police content," was the quote from the statement. So yeah, Honey Pop and Mutiny and all these other games get to stay up unchanged in their previous form, and the floodgates are open now for just all sorts of other stuff to come onto Steam. There's just a deluge of porn titles from that day onward. A lot of just crappy little amateurish visual novels, a lot of really low effort puzzle games with a lot of sliding tile puzzles where you make a picture of a naked lady, that kind of stuff like Deep Space Waifu. But with that, or I don't know, maybe you guys don't see that type of stuff on your Steam store. Maybe it's just me. I know they tailor content to your history and tastes and stuff. And speaking of which, there's more to adult games than all of that. There's actually a long, rich history, particularly in Japan, where all of these adult-oriented genres sort of originated. They call them eroge. It's a portmanteau of the English phrase erotic game, shortened to eroge in Japan. There's no getting around this. I used to play a lot of these types of games back in the day, particularly when I was in high school and in the early days of college. Got into them through a site called Home of the Underdogs, which had a lot of freeware titles. It didn't start out with the adult titles. It started out with a lot of freeware stuff, and then they had a great tagging system with a lot of great related game recommendations on each game page. So I think the flow went from something like Sango Fighter to related game Little Fighter to related game Variable Geo Max, which was another fighting game where you get little hentai CG scenes after each battle of the character you just beat. And it was off to the races from there. I played a lot of dating sims, stuff like True Love and Season of Sakura, some visual novels like Yume Miru Kusuri. There's some RPGs as well. I'm thinking, what was the one that I liked? It was Brave World, Brave Earth, something like that. Anyways, and they're not all horrible games. There's like actual games underneath these. Again, the long history of these types of games being released in Japan, particularly on consoles like the PC-88 and MSX and that kind of stuff. So, with that said, all of this sets the stage for the release of Eroico on Steam. I don't really play these types of games anymore. It's very similar to my relationship with JRPGs that I've gone into a lot on the channel here. It's something that I had a strong interest in the past, but I've kind of grown out of it. But that past interest has maintained a sort of ongoing passive interest. So even though I don't play these types of games anymore, I pay attention to them. I do have that show adult content box checked on Steam, so I see stuff like this from time to time, and I thought this one looked actually kind of interesting. A bit of a nostalgic throwback to some of the other Aero 2D platformers that I played back in the day. It looked pretty good, kind of interesting. I picked it up. It's a 2D platformer with nice pixel art, very fluid sprite animation. Very similar game to Iconoclasts in a few ways. You got that, bright, colorful pixel art style. You've got a very diverse, well fleshed out core move set. Both games have Ico in the title, so that's about it. I don't know. I decided to stick it here because this is what I've been playing lately. This is a surprisingly decent little game, actually. It got very solid underlying mechanics. Like the actual game, there's an option where you can turn off the adult content here and just skip all of the CGs and the sex sprite animations and stuff, and just play the game. And the core game itself is actually surprisingly solid. The mechanics are, some people would call them clunky. I prefer to think of these types of games as thoughtful, because your character is a bit slow and cumbersome. Your moves take a lot of forethought. It's more in the kind of Castlevania Ghouls and Ghosts tradition of 2D platformers, although still considerably more fluid to control than those other games. I shouldn't use words like fluid when discussing a game like this. Anyways, yeah, it's got a good combat system, surprisingly diverse move set. Apart from your regular 1-2 slash, you've got shield block, you've got dashing thrust attack. I should probably not use the word thrust either, whatever, half my vocabulary. Never mind. You've got a couple different types of aerial down stabs, one where it's kind of a downward slam. Is slam legal for this type of game? Anyways, and also another downward slashing attack where you can kind of bounce on the enemy's heads, Zelda 2 style. It has kind of combat has a bit of a Zelda 2-ish feel. Yeah, you've got your shield block, your magic bolts you can fire out of your sword. A lot of different moves at your disposal. Surprisingly robust combat system, which is kind of the main feature of the gameplay section of the game, I would say. Obviously not the main feature of the game itself. The enemies in themselves are a bit disappointing by contrast. They're very, very simplistic. They basically just have one simple behavior and one attack that they'll use. But there are a lot of enemies. So the core gameplay is kind of you fending off or evading hordes of just an onslaught of cat girls, fairies, minotaur girls, that kind of stuff. And if they catch you, we'll get to that later. But with that said, the bosses are surprisingly decent as well. They're certainly a lot more involved than the basic enemies, which just have one attack. Bosses will have multiple attacks, kind of an attack pattern that they go through, although the bosses are largely based on trial and error. They'll have an attack pattern that they go through. You learn the pattern because your character is a bit too slow to manage their attacks on reaction. And with that said, it's a very challenging game, even on the easiest setting. Like, all said and done, even despite being an adult title, there's an actual game here that's reasonably solid. It's kind of on the low budget end of indie 2D sprite-based platformers as well. And okay, so let's get into the arrow mechanics here. So there's a few different types of arrow platformers. Like I said, there's this long tradition of these types of games where basically you got two types. You got the types of games where you sex the enemies, and you got the ones where the enemies sex you. And this is one of the latter type, where you've got a mechanism where if you take certain types of hits, or if you get knocked around too much, your character will get stunned, and you've got to kind of mash the controls to get out of it. And if the enemies catch you when you're down, it'll initiate a little sex scene, which is all gorgeously animated in this kind of pixel style here. It feels like a lot more effort. The animation in the game is very solid overall. Just the general move set, the enemy animations and stuff. It seems like just a fair bit more love went into the sexy pixel animations than the other stuff, though. Like, I think there's more frames of animation in the looping animation of, like, cat girls bouncing on the main character's D has more frames of animation than the character's walk cycle, for example. Like, even core stuff like that. So yeah, it's the same kind of mechanism as if you guys played Tifa Tan X back in the day. And if you haven't, that's it's that Tifa. It's a Final Fantasy VII erotic fan game, which is, again, kind of a beat 'em up where you're fending off hordes of enemies, based on the NES game Kung Fu, if you know that one. And apart from that, if you game over, then your character just gets knocked out and jumped by the nearest enemy. And then for your game over screen, you got a little sex CG that gets unlocked in a gallery every time you see that. So it's challenging. The game's challenging for a reason. The game wants you to lose so you can see all of these sexy CGs. The CGs are not up to the same standard of quality as the pixel graphics. Certainly not the best stuff I've seen in terms of just CG artwork in an adult game before. And if you're not into that kind of stuff, you can turn off the adult content and it's still a decent little game, but also at a slightly higher price point than a lot of other little pixel graphic indie games like this. Like I can recommend like stuff like Rex Rocket, for example, which is a much better game than this, is about half the price. So you really are kind of paying a little bit of a premium for that extra adult content. So it's a little bit pricey for what it is. Yeah, you're paying a premium for the adult stuff here for sure. So which is tough competition when there's a lot of other high quality indie pixel art retro style games out there. Stuff like again Rex Rocket, Castle in the Dark. Better games than this at lower price points. So it's a tough competition, but it was fun while it lasted. Can I say well it lasted? Forget it. Recommended for fans of eroge in general, and probably only them. Although if you really want to, if it looks interesting to you, it's a decent little game. Check it out if you're into that kind of thing, or don't. I don't know. I probably can't stream this game, unfortunately, so you'll have to check it out for yourselves if you're interested. Are you interested in this kind of stuff? There's another one I've been looking at called Hakoniwa Explorer Plus, which looks kind of interesting to me, that I might cover on the podcast. If I'm oversharing with you guys with this little segment here, let me know, and I will just never talk about this kind of stuff ever again and just keep it to myself. But this is an experimental little segment. Let's move on to the stream news. Okay, so next segment, we're just a brief little recap of the games I'm playing here on stream and how the playthroughs are going right now. So we're doing Vandal Hearts right now. That's been going for a couple weeks. The idea initially was to do a challenge playthrough where I take all the bad promotions for all the characters. That's Guardsmen, Hawk Knights, and Monks. Just nothing but that. Take none of the good promotions. Then someone, while I was playing, had the notion, well, it's like, why not just do no promotions if you want to do a challenge run? So I thought, now we're talking. So I did that for a little while, and it was really fun for a little while. It made some of the later battles really challenging. Once you get up to about chapter 3 or so, there's a big ramp up in difficulty where you're expected to have your characters promoted for several battles by that point. Like, you're basically doing like half as much damage as you're used to and taking twice as much damage. And it turns out that that eventually broke me. I was not able to complete the game under these challenge stipulations. I got up to, I think, the 4th fight of chapter 3, which was a bit, just way too much for me. I got stuck on otherwise easy fight, or a fight that would have been easy with promotions, and sure enough, I abandoned the challenge, or I went back to the original challenge of doing bad promotions as opposed to no promotions. And sure enough, after I promoted my character, this fight that I was stuck on for like 2 hours became an absolute joke. My characters were practically invincible after promoting, although that immediate difference, I actually learned a lot from that in terms of just the game mechanisms here and the way damage calculations work. So kind of the whole reason why I like doing these types of challenge playthroughs of games. It's a good way to get a fresh take on a game, add some new challenge to it, and also learn some interesting little things that you might not have known before. A lot of the sprite animations and the cutscenes in the later portions of the game I'd never seen before with the original character sprites, because they had to animate those characters during these scenes for every possible promotion class, including ones that you're likely to have abandoned by that point. All right, I gotta. So yeah, we're kind of shifted the definitions of the challenge at this point. We're on, I think, chapter 5 of the game by now. We've shifted the challenge to bad promotions and also delayed promotions. There's a second promotion that you get when your characters hit level 20, and I'm going to try to delay that for as long as possible and see if we can't get through the rest of the game with only the first promotion. And if we can't, we'll just be broken and abandon it again. So the other thing I've been playing here on stream is Team Sonic Racing. This is not really a main playthrough I'm doing. I'm not doing a full playthrough of the story mode here or anything. It's just a little filler game that I do from time to time when I have a couple hours of to spare for streams. I'm a really big Sonic and Sega fan in general. I really liked the previous Sonic and Sega All-Stars racing games. So I was really interested in this one. This was a day one purchase for me, just because it's been a long time since I played some Sonic Racing, and I was kind of hit me at the right time. I was kind of in the mood to do some Sonic Racing. With that said, there's some mixed reviews of Team Sonic Racing going around on the internet. I think I liked it. I think I like this game more than most people do. I'm more positive on this game than the rest of the internet as a whole seems to be. With that said, there's a lot of steps back from the previous game, Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed. Just weird little back steps. For starters, you can see they cut Sega All-Stars from the title here, and there's no other Sega properties in this game, which is a big disappointment for a lot of people, including me. They've switched to Sonic characters only. They've stripped out all the Shinobi, Golden Axe, Jet Set Radio, all that other stuff is just gone. Which I guess I owe some apologies to some people who were telling me about this game in chat when I was mentioning how I was excited for it. Someone told me that they were taking out all the extra Sega stuff. It's like, yeah, Sonic characters only. And I told them, I said to them, that can't be right. Sega owns all these other characters. You must be confused. There would be no reason for them to strip out all these other Sega characters that they own the rights to. You must be thinking of stuff like the guest characters, Danica Patrick and the Yogg cast and all of that stuff. You must mean they're stripping out all of that. But no, sure enough, I was full of shit, and chat was right, and they stripped out all the other Sega content in this game, which was a big disappointment. Other steps back, there's fewer characters overall in this game in general. The single player mode is more limited. There's less content in single player, and it's kind of worse. They made the bizarre decision to gate off each story chapter with a team GP, which is like the worst game mode in the game, whereas the previous game was a lot more open. There were no big roadblocks that would get in your way. It was just based on how many stars you earned and getting through stargates. It's that kind of format where you can do the levels in any order you want, and as long as you do enough of them, like 50%ish of them, you can always move on to the next stage. Whereas here, it's just arbitrary gates. It's like, no, do this thing, and until you do this thing, you're stuck, and that's just awful. I don't know why. It's a weird regression. They got it right in Transformed. I don't know why they did it wrong here. And other things that they did right in Transformed that are wrong here too. The items are really weird because it's all Sonic themed. They decided to make all the items they're the wisps from Sonic Colors, which is a cute little idea. But the wisps a lot of them are hard to distinguish from each other. I keep mixing up the flame boost with the missile attack and other ones that look the same as each other. And again, this is not a problem that Transformed had. It's also missing a lot of the flash and style of Transformed. The aesthetics are just not quite up to snuff overall. A lot of that is just because they're missing a lot of the other Sega stuff, and a lot of the flashy transformation-based gimmicks from Transformed are just missing here. The way that the tracks would all break away and explode and change from lap to lap. You have stuff like the Burning Depths getting flooded gradually from one lap to the next. Here you just have static tracks, which is not quite as fancy and just immediately appealing here. So it sounds like I'm shitting all over this game like all the rest of the internet, but the fundamentals are solid. I think this is just to play the game. The racing fundamentals are better overall here, I think, than Sonic Racing Transformed. The boat and plane from Transformed were interesting gimmicks, but I'm glad to see them go. The car racing has always been where it's at for me, and it's that because they focused on the car racing, that is more solid here. Drifting feels a lot better here. Just the overall play control. Boosting takes a step back. They ruined the kind of just the animation or the something to do with the boost. It's harder to distinguish what level of boost you have while drifting and when it triggers exactly. Another weird regression. But other than that, the fundamental racing mechanics are solid. The tracks are very well designed, even though they aren't quite as fancy looking and flashy and exploding and transforming all the time. It's solid stuff overall. Also, the new team mechanics are surprisingly entertaining. I didn't like the idea of the whole gimmick here is you've got team races where you have two teammates and your team will place based on how many points you each earned based on where you place. So you can place first and then lose the race overall because your team finished 11th and 12th. It sounds horrible, and it is sometimes, but that doesn't happen too often. Generally, your AI allies do a good job of keeping up with you. And there's some cool team mechanics where you actually have interplay with your teammates. You've got a slingshot mechanic where if you follow in this yellow trail that your teammates ahead of you leave behind, you get a big boost. And also if you speed past an ally, say if they spin out or stall or something, if you kind of nick them with your car, they get a big boost to get back into the race. You can pass items to your teammates. You've got a team ultimate bar that you're charging constantly based on utilizing these team mechanics. It's really solid stuff. I think it adds a lot to the game, and overall I'm liking this game more and more as I play it. I think I might end up liking Team Sonic Racing better than Transformed in the end. I don't know. We'll see how it goes from here. But need to play more of it. That's it for how the current playthroughs are going. Current schedule, we're going to finish up Vandal Hearts this week. That'll probably be done on around about Friday, Saturday. After Vandal Hearts is going to be more Vandal Hearts. I'm going to dip into Vandal Hearts 2 for a little bit. We're not going to do a full playthrough of it just because Vandal Hearts 2 is kind of a bad game and I don't want to play the whole thing, but it's a very interesting game and there's a lot of cool stuff I want to show off with it. So we'll do Vandal Hearts for 1, maybe 2 streams just to show it off. And then I actually don't know what we're going to do from there. Sonic Racing is done. I don't think it's a very good stream game. It's a fun game to play, but it doesn't play well on stream. Not a lot of people seem interested in seeing it, so I'm gonna leave the Sonic Racing to my own time. I've been considering going back to Battle for Westnoth, maybe, which is a game that I'm still really interested in digging into more. I'm also keen to get Tales of Majayal has been on my mind lately, so we might do a playthrough of a character of that, just for variety's sake. Fire Emblem is the next big thing I want to dive into on the channel here, so we might just go straight into that. And I've been toying with the idea of doing a Phoenix Wright playthrough as well. So one of those things after Vandal Hearts. Haven't quite decided which yet. So that's the stream playthroughs and how they're going. Let's go into the mailbag. Okay, so it is Q&A time. We actually have no questions in the mailbag this week, and I feel like that's going to be the way it's going to be for a long time until we build kind of an audience here, which is fair. You know, we're just starting out with the podcast. I'm pretty thorough going with my discussions of stuff already, so I can understand why there'd be no questions or anything further people want to hear from me after they've been listening for over an hour and a half. We said we were going to keep this down to an hour, and we're getting there. So maybe this is just how it is. Maybe it's a 90-minute podcast. Maybe that's probably just the kind of people we are here on the Jasu review. But yeah, if there is anything you'd like to hear me talk about or questions you'd like to see answered, you can post them down in the YouTube comments for this podcast, and I will get to them next week. Or just comments over on Podomatic as well. If that's where you're getting the podcast, we got the audio download on Podomatic. Post a comment there, and I'll answer a question on next week's episode. You can reach me on Twitter. That's at Jasu Bakuhatsu. Or by email, that's jasubakuhatsu@gmail.com. And lastly, if you're catching the show live and you've got any feedback or questions you want to give me, you can just type them out here in Twitch chat. And again, as a kind of reminder, to keep the show listenable, I don't really do viewer interaction or Twitch alerts or anything during the actual podcast. We leave all that for the feedback section, and so I will read what you guys have been saying here. Hello, Mayswell. Thank you for watching. He's got some good corrections and clarifications of the stuff I was talking about during the Iconoclasts section there. Nivnov makes on-point observation about Time Spinner, saying Time Spinner did it better. I assume he's talking about environmental storytelling there and use of the Metroidvania format. If that is when that comment popped up, then I agree with him, actually. And I actually considered Time Spinner for the mini review that I would do this week, but I decided Time Spinner is kind of a bit deeper game that deserves a full main feature podcast if I decide to do Time Spinner someday. Minor interest in Eroico. So yeah, that's gonna do it for Mailbag this week. Let's wrap this shit up. Thank you again for listening to the Jasu Review podcast. Next week, we're going to do a full, lengthy discussion of Battle for Westnoth, which is going to be kind of an in-progress review. I haven't played a ton of that game, but it's a very deep and interesting one, so I've got a lot to talk about it. And we're definitely going to get into the topic of RNG and randomness in strategy games as well, so that's going to be our feature next week, is Westnoth and RNG. I have not decided on the mini review yet, but it's probably going to be either Time Spinner or The Vagrant or Mega Man 11. There's lots of stuff to choose from, so I could change my mind and do something else from then on. Until then, you can catch me live on Twitch at twitch.tv/JasuBakuhatsu. You can find the podcast and stream archives over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/JasuBakuhatsu. You can listen to the audio download of this podcast, the Jasu Review, over on Podomatic. That's jasureview.podomatic.com. And for the podcast and stream-related announcements, you can follow me on Twitter at Jasu Bakuhatsu. Until then, thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.